The world needs more zealous believers. Like, it's so refreshing now for me whenever I get to be around someone who's recently encountered Jesus and given their life to him, because they are so passionate about him. They're like, I have found the best thing in the world and I can't wait to share him with you. And I just think we all need to be a little bit more like that. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Called for More podcast. This is Jack Kehoe. Today I'm doing a solo podcast where I want to share my testimony and all the ways that God has worked in my life. So buckle up. I'm from Portland, Oregon. When I was young, I loved animals. I had over 40 pets. I'm the youngest of 3 siblings. And I was always trying to start different businesses. So I was super entrepreneurial. My first business was a lawn mowing company where I mowed all my neighbors' lawns. I printed out little flyers, Jack's lawn mowing business, and I came door to door and just started mowing lawns in order to save up enough money to then be able to buy these giant exotic tortoises. They're called redfoot tortoises from South America. And so I was able to buy a male and female giant tortoise for $600. And I also had my siblings and some of their friends invest in this business because I couldn't make all the money to buy these tortoises at the age of 12. And the idea was to start a tortoise breeding business where I would sell their babies. The tortoises did a lot of breeding, but they never actually made any babies. So it was an unprofitable business. But that's a little bit about how I was as a kid. I was very curious, very adventurous. And that curiosity, I had this kind of thrill seeker personality. I was always wanting to go cliff jumping or try new things, and kind of like a hyperactive kid. So when I was 14, I tried smoking weed for the first time. Some of my buddies I knew that they had started smoking. We were in 8th grade. And this was the summer after 8th grade. And so one day, one of my buddies was like, hey man, we're thinking about doing this. Do you want to join us? And I was like, yeah, I do want to. And I smoked. And I remember the first time I got high, it was like the most thrilling experience. I was so enamored immediately. Within a week, I had bought my own weed, was smoking by myself. Within a month, I was smoking every single day. Within a few more months, I was doing cough syrup and over-the-counter medications. I entered into high school and I would spend my days during class. I remember being in chemistry class, just on my phone under the table, reading people's experiences with different drugs. I remember there was this site called Arrowhead Experience Vaults where I would just read about people doing Molly and Coke and mixing all kinds of things. And I pretty much became obsessed with substances and with getting high. My whole life began to revolve around that. From the outside, I was still a very kind and good student. I was doing well in school. I was playing sports. So they were always surprised when they found out that I was like a behind the scenes drug addict. But the reality was I was so obsessed with drugs. I began to get in trouble from my parents, and life kind of began to go downhill a bit. I got arrested 3 days before my 16th birthday when I was 15 for being intoxicated downtown and having alcohol. I had this homeless man. I convinced the homeless man to buy me and some friends alcohol, and I had other things in my backpack. Ended up getting arrested. That night, they took me to the juvie detention center a few hours later. My parents picked me up, and I will just always remember my parents yelling at me, so disappointed in me. They asked for my phone, and they started reading through my texts, and they began to realize just how far gone I was into this life of addiction and stealing and dealing drugs in my school. And so fast forward, life continued to just be me getting in trouble. I became depressed. I was on antidepressants. I was like borderline suicidal. I wasn't actively trying to take my own life, but I would drink 2 bottles of Robitussin, a cough syrup that makes you kind of hallucinate and trip out. And then I would just go drive around in my car and I'd be like, all right, we'll see what's going to happen. Eventually my parents, they were like, hey, we either want to send you to rehab or to military school. Like, what do you want to do? And I kind of convinced them, hey, let's just move somewhere else. So we moved to Southern California to a private Catholic school with drug dogs coming down the halls. So we did that. My parents, like, so kind of them, and they dropped everything, their whole lives, to move to Southern California to try to help me. And I just ended up getting into harder drugs down there. I had more access to things like Molly and Coke and concentrated marijuana, dabbing, and taking oils. And all that stuff just messed with my head. I just kind of became more depressed and lost. And I didn't expect at this point to live past the age of 21. I just kind of knew this is my life's path. I'm just kind of focused on drugs and I'll just enjoy it while I have it. Until one day, the summer after my junior year of high school, I was 17, a youth pastor calls me up out of the blue. And growing up, we would go to church sometimes when I was in Oregon. And I had met this youth pastor, his name was John, a number of years before, and he still had my phone number. So he called me up out of the blue and he's like, hey man, I'm taking the youth group on this mission trip to San Francisco to serve the homeless. And I just thought of you. Would you want to come on this trip? And I was shocked that he would call me and invite me because growing up in my town, as a town of 36,000 people, everyone kind of knew everyone. And I was not the kid that people wanted to invite places. I was the kid that no parent wanted their kids to hang out with. But this youth pastor, John, called me up out of the blue. And I just want to pause for a moment. Like, if there's a person in your life that you think is too far gone, let me tell you, they are not too far gone, and they may just be waiting for that invitation from you. And even now, if there's someone you're thinking of, like, I want you to just text them or give them a call and invite them to come to church or to the mission trip, because you never know who is just waiting for an invitation. Because I think anyone would have thought I was too far gone at that point. But I said yes to go on this mission trip. So I flew up to Portland, Oregon, and I got on this mission trip bus drunk and high with 67 other high school students to go and serve the homeless. And while I was on this trip, I kind of came in, I don't know how this is going to be with a bunch of Christians, but I'll just figure it out. And halfway through this trip, there was a night where it was a worship night, and it was one of those, on mission trips, there's often like a really emotional night, and a lot of students have their hands in the air and are worshiping Jesus and crying and moved. Like, I can just see they're moved emotionally. And I remember feeling nothing. And I just looked around. I was like, man, either they're missing out on all the fun that I'm getting to experience in life, or they have something that I don't have. And that thought caused me to pray. And I just said, God, if you're real, in my head, God, if you're real, would you show me something? Simple prayer. And I recommend that to everyone that's exploring Jesus, just to say, God, like, would you show me? If you're real, show yourself to me. I believe God honors that prayer. So that night, instead of going to bed, I ended up staying up late with a guy that worked at this mission. His name was Zach. He was 19. He was the first Christian that I actually thought was cool and that I could connect with. He played basketball and I respected him. He had given up a scholarship, a college scholarship, to play sports in order to come and serve to serve the homeless in San Francisco. And I was just shocked by that. I was like, hey man, how do you know God is real? You know, you're giving your life to this thing. What have you seen him do? And Zach began to share with me miracle stories. He began to share he shared a story of praying for a woman on the streets who was in a wheelchair. Her knee was all messed up. Zach prayed for her, and right in front of his eyes, in a moment, this woman got healed and stood up, and she was weeping and crying. And then he told me another story of God speaking to him in a dream and actually showing him this girl. He's having a conversation with this girl, and then her phone number appears. He asks her for the phone number. He sees the phone number and he wakes up and he remembers the phone number. And he's like, what the heck? So he calls this phone number. The girl from his dream answers and he begins to share with her about Jesus and she's encountering the Lord. And I had never heard stories like this up to that point. I was just amazed. And Zach was one of those kind of guys where I could just tell he was being honest. And so I was so moved. I left that room and I prayed in a stairwell. I said, God, I believe you're real. I want to live for you. I want to love people like Zach does. I'm sorry for all the ways that I've gone astray from you. But I give you my life, Jesus. Simple prayer in my head in a stairwell. Go to bed that night. Next morning, I wake up feeling totally different. I feel light and joy for the first time in years. It feels like I've taken a backpack of weights off. And then my vision is clearer and brighter. I can actually see colors more vibrantly. And I just feel great. So I go about that day, the next day, and I'm still like, I'm having a great time. But I'm like, how am I going to leave this and have a changed life? Or how am I really going to sustain this? Because I have no Christian friends back home. And on the last night of this trip, I end up in a room with a group of guys, like 10 to 12 guys, and this same missionary guy, Zach. And in this room, we're having conversation, and it is one of the most vulnerable conversations I've ever heard. Like high school guys my age are crying and sharing about how they've encountered God over this past week. And as they're talking, I'm wearing a cross necklace, and I began to grip this cross necklace in my hand really tightly. And I begin to zone out of this conversation, and I'm staring into space, and I realize I'm staring at a Bible. And I'm like, what the heck? Why am I staring at this Bible? I feel weird. I didn't take any drugs. I don't know what's happening right now. And I began to say this phrase in my head over and over, God, help me help them, God. God, help me help them, God, over and over. And I'm like, what is going on right now? And as I'm doing this, Zach had been telling all of this group of guys about Acts 2 in the Bible, when the Holy Spirit, after Jesus has ascended, and he sends the Holy Spirit onto the believers and they're baptized with tongues of fire. And then Zach says, hey, I want to pray for you guys that you might experience the Holy Spirit. And a little bit of background, I'm here with a Presbyterian church. It's not a charismatic church. Kind of emotional experiences are not a norm within this church context that I'm in. But Zach says, I want to pray for you guys. And so I drop the cross and I hold hands with the two friends next to me. And as soon as Zach begins the prayer, my whole body begins to shake and I feel heat all up and down my body. He ends the prayer and I'm just feeling amazing. My whole body is shaking and I lean back in the chair and I leave my body and I enter into this bright white light, like this beautiful, eternal, never-ending white light. And it looks like the most beautiful crystals you've ever seen. And I was in that light for about 2 minutes. And I remember I was fully aware of my body. My mouth dropped open. I was just in awe because it was the best feeling I'd ever felt in my entire life up to that point. And let me tell you, I have searched for many different feelings in many different places, and genuinely no high can compare to the Most High, to an encounter with the living God. And I realized in this experience that that is what I had been searching for. So I came back. I couldn't speak or move for a couple hours. Eventually, it's getting late at night. They go and they wake up the youth pastor and a doctor, and they come in. Youth pastor has everyone leave. And eventually, I couldn't speak or move, but my vision had been locked in this Bible. Eventually, they open up the Bible and they begin to read scriptures over me. They read Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And it felt like someone was dumping a bucket of cold water over me as they read that. It just felt like God himself was speaking to my soul. And they read a couple other scriptures. John 1:5, the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. And it was like God was breathing and speaking identity into me and a new purpose into my life. The youth pastor was unsure of if I had a seizure or if I had taken drugs or what had happened. And so he had the doctor run some tests on me to see if I had a seizure. She ran all these tests. I'm like hopping on one foot, touching my nose, naming dates. She's like, you shouldn't be able to do all this if you just had a seizure. So they were like, I guess this must be God. This experience completely 180'd my entire life because I realized that I had been on a search for some kind of experience, for some kind of truth. And I realized in this experience that I was searching for an encounter with Jesus. I found that nothing else in the world could satisfy the desires of my heart until I encountered the living God. And so after this experience, I literally gave up everything. I was healed of addiction and depression in a moment. Never again have I taken antidepressants. And I began to run after Jesus passionately. So the next day when I came home from this mission trip, I went to a party to meet up with all my friends. And I turned off the music and I was like, hey, everybody, gather around. I have to tell you something. I have to tell you what's happened to me. And I shared this testimony that I just shared with you with all my friends. And they were just sitting there, to be honest, like many of them had their mouths open. They were like, what the heck? A bunch of my friends were like, Jack had a seizure and met God. And they really had no idea what to do with it. But a number of my friends came to encounter Jesus and give their lives to him as well. And my senior year of high school, my family ended up moving back to Oregon. And so if you can imagine, I left, like I'd gotten arrested the year before I left. I had broken out my 2 front teeth because I was so drunk one day. I was dealing drugs in my high school. And then I came back 2 years later and I was like, you guys, you need to meet Jesus. He's the best thing ever. And I was just so zealous for the Lord, and I was so expectant to see God do what he had done in me and so many other people in my high school. And a week after I had that encounter, I ended up going on this trip with another church. I found out about this other church trip. It was a whitewater rafting trip, and I went on this trip. And the youth pastor there let me share on the last night my testimony. And I shared my testimony and I said, hey, I'm not sharing this to glorify myself, but because God wants to do this for every single one of us. And as I said those words, this girl falls down out of her chair and she begins to shake and she begins spewing out scripture. And she has an encounter with God very similar to my encounter a week before this. And God was just doing amazing things in my life in this season. When I started high school back up in Oregon, I started a club called the Random Acts of Kindness Club. It was a public high school, and I wanted to figure out how can I share Jesus? How can I just share love and shift the culture of this school? Because I know that I really struggled in the culture in that school to fit in, to feel like I was good enough. And so I wanted to make this place filled with love because that's who Jesus is. And so I started a club called Random Acts of Kindness Club where we would go and do kind acts. And I remember on club day, I was there holding up my sign. I had no idea how many people would join. You guys, over 200 people joined this club, like a bunch of people that were not Christians. And we would just love on people every single week. On every Friday, we would hold open all the doors, play fun music, give people high fives, and give them compliments as they came into school. We'd be like, you're awesome, you're amazing, you look incredible today, just so that people would feel loved and seen and known. And we did so many other things like this. And then some friends and I started a Bible study, and it just started with a few of us, and it grew and grew. And I had a number of friends get saved through that Bible study. Like one of my friends was Buddhist and he was like, I'm open to all kinds of religions. That's what I love about Buddhism. So I was like, all right, come on to our Bible study. Check it out. He came, I think on the second week, ended up giving his life to Christ. And it was just an amazing year of seeing God pour out his presence in my high school. And at the end of the year, in front of the whole school, I was awarded with, they called it the Jess Rhodes Service Award for being someone who serves behind the scenes and like shifts the culture of our school for the good. And it was just this amazing kind of redemption year where God began to, it says in the Bible that the Lord, I think it's in Malachi, that the Lord restores the years the locusts have eaten. And I always find that encouraging because like the locusts ate away a lot of my life in those previous years, but God restores all things for his good. And it was just this incredible year. There were ups and downs, obviously, with learning how to walk the Christian walk. I made a lot of mistakes dating-wise and hurt some people because I was just a baby believer, a zealous baby believer, figuring things out and wanting to lead others to the Lord. And I want that to just be an encouragement to you wherever you're at. Like, never let your zeal die. If you have an idea and it has to do with sharing love or sharing Jesus, do it. Like, that is in the will of God. Go and do it. Because the world needs more zealous believers. Like, it's so refreshing now for me whenever I get to be around someone who's recently encountered Jesus and given their life to him, because they are so passionate about him. They're like, I have found the best thing in the world and I can't wait to share him with you. And I just think we all need to be a little bit more like that. So after this year, I thought I was going to be a missionary. My family really wanted me to go to college. So I went to Pepperdine University, and I began studying theology and biology. My sophomore year, I studied abroad in Argentina, and I started a house church with some friends where we would meet up each week. And right before this, I'd been in a relationship for a year and a half, and I thought I was going to get married to this girl. And ultimately, I stopped feeling peace about it. We had even talked about marriage. People really affirmed our relationship. But I felt like God was like, hey, I want you to give this up to me. And I just didn't feel peace about us moving forward. So we broke up, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. Still one of the hardest things, to break someone's heart who I cared for so deeply. And I just remember weeping like for days. I was so sad. But actually the day after I broke up with her, I was at my parents' place in Southern California, and I was in my room crying, and I felt like I had heard that I had this neighbor who was a prophetic lady. People had told me about her. She lived down at the bottom of my street. I didn't know which house. Her name is Lauren Hassan, and her name popped into my head, Lauren Hassan. And I was like, oh, what the heck? As I was literally weeping before the Lord, like, God, I don't understand why this is happening. And so I heard her name. I'm like, all right. I stood up, walked out the front door, started walking down to the bottom of our cul-de-sac. And I was like, I don't know which door. I'll just go to this one. I walked to the house to the left, knocked on their door, this big, huge door. And a couple of minutes later, door opens up. And it's a woman. And I'm like, hey, are you Lauren Hassan? Yes, I am. Hey, I'm Jack Kehoe. We're friends with so-and-so. And she's like, all right, well, come on in. Lauren is a very prophetic woman. She has a gift of prophecy on her life and has a ministry in the prophetic. And Lauren's like, tell me your story. I tell her this story and that I just broke up with my girlfriend yesterday of a year and a half. And Lauren's like, all right, pull out your phone. I'm going to share a word with you. And I had never experienced anything like this. I had never really heard anyone use the word like prophecy or I'm going to prophesy over you. And I was kind of uncomfortable. But Lauren began to just speak over my life, and God revealed so many things to her. It was a 30-minute prophetic word where she was like, God has been asking you to do this for a while, and he's so glad that you gave her up, that you were willing to sacrifice your ex-girlfriend to him. And he is going to, what you're going to receive for what you have given up is going to far outweigh anything you've experienced thus far. She began to speak about God pouring out his presence on me and using me in this next year in Argentina. And it was so powerful and life-changing. And the next day, I flew to Argentina to study abroad. And so I just had all this expectation. I was super heartbroken, but I had expectation for what the Lord was going to do. And I believe there is power to our expectations. And I think it's actually good to expect a lot of the Lord, because if we read the scriptures, Jesus is healing the sick. He's raising the dead. We have a miracle working God, and he does miracles today. And so we can expect him to come through. And I just had such high expectations for what God was going to do in my year abroad. I started this house church with friends, and we just began like worshiping each week and praying and seeking the Lord. And God began to pour out his presence. People began to get saved. People were miraculously healed of different things. I had a girl who she was lactose intolerant, but severely lactose intolerant. One night she accidentally had cheese or something. And she was curled up in a ball, weeping and crying in so much pain. And I had just been talking to a friend about healing, and another friend came and was like, hey, our friend is up there crying because she had lactose. And I was like, the Spirit fell on me, and I was like, you guys, God is going to heal her right now. Like, let's go. And gathered a few people. We came up, we prayed over her, and I was like, Natalie, in Jesus' name, be healed. And all her pain went away in an instant. And she was like, whoa, this has never happened before. Like, normally for 24 hours, I am crying in a ball. And then I was like, I felt like the Lord said that to pray for the full healing, not just right now. So we prayed for the full healing. And then I felt like the Lord said, Natalie, tomorrow, have a bowl of cereal in faith that God has healed you. And the next day, she had a bowl of cereal with regular milk and was totally fine. God completely healed her of lactose intolerance. Even to this day, she told me like a few years later, I've been having ice cream all the time. My family can't believe it. But God began to work miracles in our group, and people were giving their lives to him. And we would have these worship times where God would just pour out his presence. And I remember one time a girl came up to me afterwards, and she was like, I tried to stand up to go to the bathroom during worship, but I couldn't even stand because the weight of the presence of God was so heavy in the room. And this is I went to Pepperdine, which is a Church of Christ university, which is not a charismatic university. And a lot of students coming from that background have the belief that God no longer speaks or moves today, that it ended after the apostles. And so it was just incredible to see the Spirit move and break out. And that year was so transformative for me. I met some amazing mentors and missionaries who poured into me and transformed my life. Fast forward a year, my junior year, I had a dream from the Lord at the end of my sophomore year. I was studying theology. I was still planning on becoming a missionary. And in this dream, I felt like God was telling me to switch into marketing. And I wrestled with this because I was like, all right, I don't fully understand, but I'll just obey and I'll switch into this. Maybe it'll give me useful skills that I can use on the mission field one day, because I had seen that a lot of missionaries had practical skills they were using while I was in South America to serve people. And I just want to encourage you guys, like, sometimes hearing God, he can speak to us and it's like totally left field and throws us off. But I can tell you now, now a decade later, that man, was that the Lord, and man, did obeying that word completely transform the trajectory of my life. But I didn't understand it at the time, and it took several years to understand it. But I obeyed, and I changed my major to marketing. So the last 2 years, I ended up in marketing. That's what I graduated with from Pepperdine. After that, I moved up to Portland, Oregon, and I started a business. My brother let me crash on his couch for a few months for free, and I started a Facebook marketing company. And I had applied to all these mission agencies in Africa, in North Africa, in like war-torn nations. I got into some of these programs, but I didn't feel peace at the end of the day. I did not feel peace on accepting it and moving over there. So this is what I did. I felt peace on moving to Portland, which was super weird for me. But in hindsight, the Lord obviously knew what he was doing, and I just had to trust him and obey. So I moved to Portland, and I began to try to start a Facebook ad agency. And one day I find this guy on YouTube. His name is Billy Wilson, and he runs a course on Facebook, how to start a Facebook ad agency. And I felt the presence of God. I somehow knew that if I did this course, it would completely transform my life. And I was a little bit scared by that. So I grabbed my guitar, and I was like, all right, Lord, I'm just going to worship before you. And if you give me peace on this, I'll move forward and do this. And so I went and I worshiped, and I just wept before the Lord. I was like, God, I give you my life. You know I don't care about money. I just want to do missions, but I give this to you. If you want me to, I will do this guy's online course. I felt his peace. I felt his presence so powerfully. So after that, I bought this course, and I started learning how to start a Facebook ad agency. Over the next couple of years, that turned into a real estate marketing agency, which I then built for 3 years. where we hired our editors out of human trafficking out of the Philippines and built a team of 15 shooting luxury homes, shooting photos, videos, building websites to help market some of the nicest homes in America in Oregon, California, and Washington. We even shot for Jason Oppenheim from Selling Sunset. I shot a listing for him and some other people on his team. And we would shoot for a lot of the top agents in the country. There was just a lot of favor on this business because I was following the Lord's plan. And we even just got to minister to a lot of our clients. And I was able to build a team and disciple some of the guys who were on my team. Just an amazing experience. And I realized through it that I had a huge passion for business. While I was doing that, I had a vision to create a discipleship home where guys could come together and live in intentional community and pursue the Lord, center their lives around prayer. So I was able to buy a broken down 7-bedroom house from the 1970s. It had different colored shag carpets in each room. So in one room, there was pink shag carpet. In one room, there's a green shag carpet. In one room, there's blue and there's a pink toilet. It was like, and the bottom floor is all stained with cat pee. All the carpets are. So I bought this house and me and my buddies moved into it, started renovating the whole thing. And we built a prayer room downstairs where we would host like 24 hours of prayer. We would stay up through the night just praying and interceding and worshiping. And then we would host gatherings of leaders and pastors in the city, big dinners. And we started a ministry called The Table, some friends and I, where each week we would cook a meal and have a super long table and invite like 30, 40, 50 young adults into our home. We'd have a meal, we'd take communion, we'd worship, and we'd hear teaching. And it was just amazing to see God move out of this house of guys living intentionally, centered around prayer and hospitality. And one of my buddies moved into this house, and at the time that he moved in, he was still smoking weed, really trying to figure out his walk with the Lord. And he moved in and just radically encountered Jesus. He lived in that house for a couple years, my buddy Brandon, and just became so passionately in love with Jesus. And really God healed him of a lot of things. And he grew such a heart for purity before the Lord. And then he ended up buying another house, starting a house for creatives and worship leaders and hosting a weekly worship night out of that house. Some other people that were coming to the gathering started a couple different women's discipleship homes where they lived intentionally in community. And it was just this amazing season in Portland to see like young people encountering Jesus, learning to hear his voice, getting hungry for his presence. I remember one friend, after we did the first 24 hours of prayer and worship, she texted me and she was like, hey, it was all guys that lived in our house. And she was like, hey, can I use your guys' prayer room next Friday night? And I was like, sure. She ended up coming, staying up again through the entire night by herself, praying in our prayer room. And then the next Friday, she did the same thing. And the next Friday, she came and she would just stay up and pray for 12 hours straight and then go to work the next day. And it was this incredible season of seeing God just encounter people in such radical ways. At the close of that season, I began to feel the Lord releasing me. I remember going on a hike one day, and it was an amazing season, and it was also very full because I was running my growing business, and I was running the ministry and the discipleship home, and it felt very full. It was very fulfilling, but it was also there were heavy components to that. And also one of the cool things about the Lord speaking to me about business was he really restored my relationship with my family. My family's all from Portland. When I came to Christ, I was so zealous that it was very abrasive in my family. And I honestly caused a lot of difficulty in relationships because I changed so radically, so quickly. And not everyone could understand that. And in this season, the Lord had brought me back to Portland, and I was really able to rebuild and restore my relationship with my family, which was such a blessing. But at the end of this season, I went on a hike one day, and I just remember praying, like, Lord, would you release me from this? And I felt like it was prompted by him. And I felt peace come over me, and I was weeping as I was on a hike, and I just felt like God released me from the ministry. And this was months before I actually left Portland. about a month or two later is when I met Riley, my friend. If you've listened to the podcast, you've heard our story. If not, you can go back. Riley and I share our story in two parts. So that's kind of where this is leading into. But it was just this beautiful transition where the Lord had already released me from everything. And so it made sense when I met Riley, and I pretty quickly knew that she was my wife and that the Lord was inviting me into a different season, where then I moved down to Southern California. But that's what I wanted to share of my testimony today. I'll leave you guys off there. But today, you guys, like, that was over a decade ago now. I was 17 when I encountered Jesus. That was 11 years ago. And I'm still just as passionately in love with Jesus today. And I want to encourage you, like, don't let your fire burn out. In Revelation, it's where John is getting this revelation from an angel speaking to the churches. And against the church in Laodicea, they say, you have left your first love. You've forgotten your first love. This is Jesus saying that you've forgotten me, your first love. Do the things you did at first. And I just want to remind you, when you came to Christ, there's probably a season where, or if you grew up in the church, you had a moment where you really took your faith personal and you begin to encounter the Lord and you were passionate about him. You were in love with him. You wanted to spend time with him. Do the things that you did then. Like for me, you guys, that's worship. Pretty much every single day, like at least 4 or 5 days a week, I play the guitar and I sing for like 20, 30 minutes to the Lord. I just sing whatever's on my heart. I'm not even a good guitar player. I'm not even a good singer. And I just play 4 chords and I sing and I worship him. I adore him. And I spend time in the Word every day. And my wife and I get the pleasure of doing ministry together. I now run a business. I run a real estate company. I ended up selling my previous company a year ago before Riley and I went off to do missions. But I realized I love business. I love discipleship. I love prayer. And I really love Jesus. So I hope that this podcast, this testimony was encouraging to you guys. Thank you for those of you that stayed in it with me to the end. Let me know what you thought. I'd love to hear your feedback, what resonated with you, what was impactful. And I just want the encouragement to be to do the things that you did at first. Don't forsake your first love. Your adoration for Jesus is the most important thing about you. Continue to pursue him, continue to love him. And find those people around you that look like they're too far gone or they're disinterested and pull them in. Like invite them to church, pull them in. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thanks for joining in on the podcast.